Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning, this episode will talk about suicide. In a letter to his fiancée, Felice Bauer, Franz Kafka said, "No, I don't believe the famous doctors. I only believe doctors when they say that they don't know anything. And aside from that, I hate them." I can sympathize a little. I've gone a few rounds with doctors and therapists in my time, more than a few. I've walked out on some therapists mid-session and been fired as a patient by others. One psychiatrist called me the most stubborn person he'd ever met, while another, presumably overworked, screamed at me when I asked how soon I could be released from an involuntary hospitalization. But then there are the amazing, intuitive, and generous doctors and therapists whom I've been lucky enough to meet. Psychotherapist, award-winning writer, and licensed martial artist Ellis Amdur is among them. He never treated me as a patient, but I've copy-edited some of his books, and his intelligent observations about BPD are scattered throughout the book I'm currently writing. Ellis shared with me a talk that he gave about BPD to a mental health outreach team. It was lucid, insightful, and utterly devoid of dis-ease. This contrasted with my current therapist confiding in me that many of her colleagues feel uncomfortable with people with BPD and the idea of treating them. But Ellis doesn't shy away from people with BPD. He doesn't reduce clients to a few sentences in the DSM. Having lived for years in Japan and excelled as a creative writer, he appreciates, I think, the fact that language can both detail and dissemble. He makes room for the minute and the mythic in his interactions with and understanding of other people, and he celebrates spaciousness. In this first part of my interview with him, we talk about his background, his mentor James Hillman, why we still need diagnoses, and how we need to be more open to surprise. If you ever inform a person there's no surprise in you, Ellis says, they're dead in your eyes. However, he points out that some people do the same thing to themselves. Not only do clinicians say you have borderline personality disorder, like you have pneumonia, he said, but people themselves say that. They're constricted by a very narrow horizon of what they believe their human existence is to be, and they find it inescapable. I've thought about this idea a lot while writing about BPD and working on this podcast. Finding a balance between, on the one hand, acknowledging a pattern of unhealthy behaviors that make me unhappy, and on the other hand, my diagnosis being a stranglehold, is as hard as balancing all my good and bad angels on the head of a pin. I'm still working on it, because we all need to be surprised by others and to be surprising to ourselves. That makes life worth fighting for. Here's the first part of my interview with Ellis Amdur. So you have a very long and impressive background in multiple areas, including fiction writing and Japanese martial arts, psychotherapy. I know you've helped people with handling conflict situations, de-escalation. So can you give a quick overview of your background and your career as a psychotherapist or with mental health generally?
So I had my godfather was a psychiatrist, and I was brought up in a suburban community, and I thought he was so cool because his wife was English, and that was so exotic to me. He
Yeah.
married somebody from a foreign land, and so he was just a cool guy. So I was a little fascinated with whatever he was doing, which I didn't understand, and so that was sort of in the background. I got into martial arts the way probably the majority of people do when you lose a fight. And I started with backyard karate. And then when I was in college, I involved myself with a kung fu school that was run by some people from the Nation of Islam because they needed a Jewish guy in the cadre. one thing led to another, walked into a school of martial art called Aikido, which was utterly beautiful. I was enthralled by that, started to train in that, ended up living in a guy's dojo, living on the mat. It was right off the Bowery in New York City. Went to Japan. Oh, by the way, somewhere in that mix, I went to college. I was fascinated with Jungian psychology, which very, very intellectualized, fascinating form of psychology, which focuses on the mythic structure of human consciousness.
I have a follow-up question coming specifically about that and James Hillman. So we'll return to that.
Yeah. Okay. So I went to Japan, and then I found these archaic martial arts, one of which called the Araki-ryu, the other Tenshin Buko-ryu. And these things have roots in a period of Japan 400 years, 500 years in the past.
Yeah.
People erroneously say they are the arts of war. They are not. They are the outcome of war, where people left the battlefield and tried to make something coherent from an experience of chaos. And of course, when you do that, you use what you know. If your chaotic environment involved birds, you would probably become a bird watcher. If you were a warrior, you're going to probably do something around martial arts. And so they made these cadre. This is, again, 400, 500, 600 years ago, centered around an idealized form of behavior associated with their own caste, which was a warrior caste. What was interesting is that if you think of these as little seeds, they had a cultural valence and they began to expand. And about 400 years ago, Japan achieved a totalitarian peace. And the martial arts became more and more pervasive, first as a form of training for those in the warrior caste. And it basically templated, this is how you behave as the agents of the state, which is really what it comes down to. But the values started to diffuse. And by the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, more and more non-warrior caste people started joining these schools, until it became diffused throughout the whole society in the sort of, so by modern times, you have martial arts in the Japanese school system, physical education, and all of that. But so from that beginning, there were these old schools that somehow didn't get extinguished with modernity. Some of them stayed. And so I got fascinated with a couple of these old schools. And I lived in Japan about 13 years. Went back to America because my instructor basically would say things to me like, you are a waste of human flesh. He's very supportive of me. And he said that the purpose of a man is to affect the world. And, I know there's a modern way of speaking. I'm going to speak the way he spoke. He says that if a man does not try to affect the world and just exists, he doesn't deserve to live. And he says, I don't care what you do, but if you're studying power, and if you don't use power to affect the world in some way, you're just a waste. And that ate at me. And I tried to think, okay, I believe that, but what is an ethical mode of doing that? And keeping the story short, I found the field of crisis intervention, which is a sort of subset of therapeutic psychology, where you involve yourself or ask to be involved in people in extreme situations, suicide, psychosis, maybe an aggressive situation. And I found that was just fascinating. I thought it was valuable work. But what was most interesting is what I had studied, what these people 400 years ago were studying is a kind of applied psychology when you're confronting someone who means you harm or even death. And it was very sophisticated in that level. And what I learned was directly applicable. All I had to do was flip it upside down. So rather than it being, okay, now I can read you and defeat you, it's how do I read the situation and use that to both of our advantage? And through that, came back to the States, started studying phenomenological psychology, which could be called the Zen of psychology, except because it was founded in Germany and France, uses a lot of words.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that's where it all came together.
Yeah.
And from that, I did a lot of work in the area of child abuse, helping people who are being stalked. And then I started training individuals. I don't know how many thousands of people I've offered training to, and that's in the field of law enforcement, corrections, business, just about any venue you could imagine. There are aggressive people that appear in that venue. So how do you communicate with them to have the best option of the situation becoming better than when it started? So I ended up doing that work for a long time and also writing a lot of books on that subject. And
it's an amazing background, and it makes sense when you tell the story about what your teacher said to you. I think I would get really bad student evaluations if I said something like that, but I think it's great advice. So I said we'd return to the Jungian psychology. You gave me a copy of a talk that you gave about BPD to, I think, first responders, maybe?
it was a mental health outreach team, and there were actually a few law enforcement officers, but it was basically for the outreach team. Yeah.
Yeah, because we talked and you gave me some background for the book I'm writing on BPD. And when I listened to the talk again, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I was struck for the second time when you're talking about self-harm and trying to understand self-harm, cutting, things that are common with people with BPD, which are, I think it's hard for a lot of people to understand. Why do they do that? And you say that self-mutilation is a language. And then you mentioned something that your mentor, you name him as your mentor, James Hillman, said, the wounds are like a kind of mouth, and they speak with their own voice, which I think is amazing. So this time I actually looked him up and yes, saw that he founded a school called Archetypal Psychology, drawing on Jung. And then the very next day, in one of those beautiful synchronicities the universe sometimes gives us, I just discovered that my favorite podcast, Weird Studies, did an episode on Hillman, on his dreams and the unconscious. So I was listening to that. I was just fascinated. And I like the link you just made to, maybe hinted at, a link between these old martial arts and Jungian psychology. Can you tell me a little about your interactions and what you learned or what you feel you took away from James Hillman?
I was a young man. He came to my college as a special instructor. My father had just died. I was having just horrendous but awe-inspiring dreams. And because I was reading a lot of comic books, the mythic figures of modern time are comic figures, in many ways. And there was a Marvel comic called the Fantastic Four. Mm-hmm. And among them is the Human Torch. And in Jungian terms, he is the puer aeternus. He's the eternal boy, the flaming youth who never touches down. And I kept having this dream that I was this flaming being, and under me was just a burned out landscape with nothing but ash. And it was a very frightening dream. So I went to apply. He and his partner, Pat Berry, who's written a book called Echo's Subtle Body, only book she's ever written. It's a very powerful book. They were each going to teach a seminar. And so there were hundreds of students who wanted to get into the seminar, these two seminars. Yeah. And I remember I went in the first time and I tried to present myself as very confident, very all that. And in other words, I tried to present myself with narcissistic personality disorder. I call it eggshell consciousness. You have this beautiful iridescent shell that you present to the world, but it's very fragile. And, if somebody ever cracks it, you lash out at that person because they cracked your facade. And I remember just the expressions on their face, they read me. And I remember climbing a tree and just sitting in this tree thinking, this is so important to me and I've just blown it. So I waited until they had all the interviews and I knocked on the door. I said, can I speak to you again? And I basically told them who I really was. It was a mess in many ways, but it was honest. And so I started studying with both of them. And it was sort of an advance to what happened to me in Japan, because I became in Japanese, you call it otomo, the person who accompanies as a disciple the teacher. I would drive him to different colleges and things like that. And I think I amused Hillman. What was interesting about Hillman, he was an interesting mix of a human being. In some ways, he was very cold. There's a distance he had to people. So he came out of the Jungian background. And people who don't know Jung, the sort of pop Jung is Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey. Yeah. And basically, like the Stations of the Cross, you march through a bunch of psychic experiences until you reach, in a sense, the walled city, the Temenos. And once you arrive there, you have arrived at yourself. It's this journey to become a hero. And Hillman's perspective is that is just one myth among many. It is the dominant myth of the West, but it is no more true than another myth. And one could say on a mythic level, an attachment to one myth is the equivalent of a personality disorder, right? That this is the only perspective that matters, the only perspective that's true. And so what Hillman said is, there is no final destination for a human being, that you move from point to point like stars in the sky. The other image he used to use was like being in the ocean at night with the eyes of fish all around, right? That sort of wink in and out of existence. He had beautiful poetic images like that. And so his psychology on a, if you will, a spiritual intellectual level offered this spaciousness within your unconscious, if you will, that there was sort of an endless world that you could explore. And to some degree, it was mapped out through myths, taking into account that cliche, the map is not the territory. You have to wend your own way through. The same way in psychological theory, you mentioned borderline personality disorder, and there's a bunch of criteria that people will assert. And yes, they will put you generally in the territory, but that's not the human being. And the moment that you hew to those theories, you kill that person because you say, you can't surprise me. And if you ever inform a person there's no surprise in you, they're dead in your eyes. So I did not find, in terms of practice, the archetypal psychology / Jungian psychology, I didn't find that a congenial way to be. It's a very hothouse intellectual environment, that style of work. But it informed me to some degree in how I see the world, which was really worthwhile.
I love the idea of spaciousness. That's beautiful. And I agree. I feel like surprise is almost like divine grace or something. It's what quickens the world and other people for us. And I know you tend to, when you talk about personality disorders, you tend to say, rather than a person with BPD, you'll say a person in the borderline style. And is that part of it, kind of giving them the space to be something else or just something more than that?
Well, not only are people constricted by other people, they are very much constricted by themselves. And, so since most of my field was crisis intervention, the people in a crisis, if it's not the crisis of the piano's falling on my head, the only option is to get out of the way or I'm crushed. But a lot of crises, even though they're very immediate, like suicide, for example, it's not necessarily like that. So, I'm in graduate school and I started working on a crisis line because I had almost no experience of any kind in the psychological realm, actual practice. And I was so nervous when I got started because I thought, these people are going to call, they're suicidal. And, I was very anxious. And the trainer was saying, look, only 1 out of 20 calls to the line have anything to do with suicide. People will call because, their electricity has been cut off or all sorts of things. And you'll be coached. If needs be. We have a second line. If you're having any trouble on a call, you just wave. The supervisor will come, listen on a second line, and they'll coach you. So I sign in for my first shift, put on the headphones. The phone rings, and the first thing I hear in my entire career in this field is, I have a gun to my head, and you have 10 seconds to tell me whether I should live or die. So I immediately whirl around for my supervisor, and she's on another call. And I'm like just counting down the second, and she doesn't respond. And literally there's just silence on both sides. And we get to 9 seconds. And all of a sudden I realized he may claim there's 10 seconds. I don't have to agree. Honestly, I wasn't thinking this through. I'm feeling this, right?
Yeah.
And I just said, oh, wow. Hey, before we go any further, I got to tell you something. I'm in graduate school and we're studying existentialist philosophy right now. Man's search for meaning, the confrontation of life and death. But I'm just reading about in books. You're in it right now. We have got to talk. And there's this long silence. He goes, yeah. And 4 hours later, it was resolved. And what I realized is perhaps my most important responsibility, or at least among them, is not to agree with another person's perception of themselves. So not only do clinicians say you have borderline personality disorder, like you have pneumonia, but people themselves say that long before anybody gave them a term for that. They're constricted by a very narrow horizon of what they believe their human existence is. Mm-hmm. And they find it inescapable. They try. Nobody tries harder than a person in the borderline style, because their heart is broken over and over again because they will do what other people say. You know, there's some people with certain styles where they say, I ain't going to do that. But honestly, people in the borderline style can be so trusting of the authority because there's this bonding of trust that happens really quickly, right? Yeah. Once the relationship's established. And they say, well, if you do this, if before bed you drink a cup of warm milk, you'll sleep well. And they'll try it. And then their heart will be broken and they'll think, I failed. He wouldn't have told me that, or she wouldn't have told me that unless it works for most people. I'm uniquely diseased. So all this by way of saying, I refuse to accept that negative self-definition. And it's not that I can sit there and give a person put-ups and say, oh no, if you just buckled down and took a few language courses, you could become a translator. It's right. Not some silly thing like that. And again, I don't know what their possibilities are, but I will not abandon the possibility of being surprised. Going back to what I said before.
You mentioned in that talk that the term BPD is often a slur that therapists use to describe the clients they're least effective with. And, you know, so you have the people like that, and then you have the people like you. And I mean, you talk so lucidly and insightfully about BPD, and you don't have what it feels like some therapists have, this, like they're almost kind of spooked by it, or by personality disorders in general. Is it that they're not thinking of this? They're not willing to be surprised by these patients? Is it that they are afraid of not being successful, or having a patient react badly to them, or losing a patient?
Everybody's different. But I mean by that, there can be all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons can be the high demand, the feeling of being made responsible, the sense of helplessness that one doesn't know what to do. I think of a case that ended tragically. It was a young woman, 19 years old. She was in that style. And I was working at a clinic where I was responsible 28 days out of a month for all after hours calls for an HMO, for a whole county. So I was on all the time. And so this young woman, she would call when she was feeling suicidal. But she also, her psychiatrist had made a terrible mistake, which she gave her home phone number. Because it is an act of kindness to establish boundaries, because anybody who is boundaryless is put in a toddler situation, which is you cry and the world comes to you. And then, of course, for a toddler, the needs never end. As adults, we have to learn, you know, we don't get all our needs met. We don't get all our desires met. And other people have their own desires and needs, and we have to respect those. And if in any relationship, if we don't exist with that person that way, well, one person feels like a victim, becomes exploited, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at any rate, so this young woman would call, she would say she was suicidal. I couldn't fix her life. She had terrible things going on in her life. So I would listen to her for a few minutes as she said that, and then I would immediately shift and say something like, last time we talked, you had a math test coming up. How'd you do on that test? And she, oh, I got an A. And I would just say, with all this stuff going on, you got an A. What did you do to make that possible? Now, how did you organize yourself so all the crap in your life, you could do that? And we would talk about her strengths. See, it's not up to me to say, look, you are so smart, you're good in math. Put-ups are useless. In a sense, I'm trying to bring to consciousness, you're not how you're defining yourself right now. Not just that. And usually within 15 minutes, she would say, thank you for talking to me. I'm going to go to bed now. The problem was she'd think about it for an hour or so and say, I better check in with my psychiatrist and see what she thinks. She would call the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist would panic. She's suicidal. She would immediately make a big deal out of it, sometimes call the police. And eventually, this young woman killed herself. And as far as I'm concerned, the reason for that was the heroic fantasy. Well, I'm supposed to make it better for you. The inability of people to say, I am so sorry you're in this situation and I can't do anything to change it except communicate with you and treat you with respect. That's all I got. And I think one of the reasons that many, aside from, you know, all the chaos that can happen with somebody who is enmeshed in the style, but the other thing is if one wants successes, you know, wants to be the hero in their own journey, then somebody in the borderline style is very, very threatening.
I'm only now, after many years, thinking about mental health and also trying to think about other people's perspectives. I can imagine it must be so hard to deal with someone in acute distress, in that style, and it'd be so hard to lose a patient, so I now, looking back at it, I can see how some people might have felt about working with me and kind of understand from their side. I really agree with what you say about boundaries being a form of care, because it's something that also took me years to learn as a teacher, that putting up certain boundaries, that is what is loving, but it's hard, especially if you yourself have always had a kind of a problem with boundaries. I am going to ask you about a certain movement technique you use to help someone with BPD, but I have one more question, because this has come up in a couple of interviews with people. In the talk you gave on BPD, you mentioned that you do expect changes to the diagnosis in the next DSM update. And I've read some articles by people who are doing research on BPD who say, well, maybe we should just get rid of the whole diagnosis and scrap it. It just has too much baggage attached to it. And, you were just talking about this idea of how a diagnosis might kind of reduce someone, might be reductive. Do you think diagnoses like that, like the personality disorders, are they more of a good thing than a bad thing? Or would you just get rid of them if it were up to you?
So there's one level you say, okay, deal with the world we live in. How do things get paid? There's
insurance companies, they need a code.
Right.
Yeah.
Diagnosis ideally provides, if I think I used the word before, a map, which generally tells you something about how a style works. And if we start talking about eliminating diagnoses, then you get into, do we eliminate any descriptors? Because it's not only in the diagnostic field, we have these. It's how diagnosis is used. Now, I've long thought that rather than a diagnosis, or sometimes you put 2 or 3 diagnoses beside each other, which is a very linear way of thinking, and it leads to a narrow perspective on a person. I have long thought that there should be a 3-dimensional model. You start with a core and maybe different axes coming out with 5 points. And, with whatever way one describes different personality states. Let's say Ellis is a 3.5 on the narcissistic state, a 4 on the paranoid state, which a paranoid person is somebody who is always defending because there's an enemy somewhere. I talked about the narcissist. The borderline style is you are like a spinning top, and you look round, you look centered, but if the slightest nudge causes oscillation, right? So there's this profound vulnerability to any experience or any influence. So let's say I'm kind of low on that. And so basically you're going to have this model, which is misshapen, it's me, right? This certain shape, which gives a much more, dare I use the word, holistic sense of the makeup of that person. So diagnosis can be useful. It's just can also be very useless. I find it can be really problematic if personalized styles are things to be cured. I also find it problematic if somebody tries to be really kind of sappy and open, say, well, I don't judge people at all, and all diagnoses are judgments. And so there's this kind of open-ended structuralist attitude. I remember I went back to my own graduate school and was asked to give a talk. And, even though we're a phenomenological school, because phenomenology makes people a little anxious, because so what are the rules of phenomenology other than observe what's in front of you? So people started clinging to like neo-Freudian ideas, like self-psychology and things like that. And, to have some structure, I suppose. Right. And so there was actually a lot of talk about transference and countertransference. For anybody listening who is informed on this. So transference is the idea that when you speak to me, something in me evokes an experience or memory of somebody in your past, so you treat me like somebody in your past. Countertransference is when I do that to you and I'm in the therapeutic situation, right? So, for example, that's talked a lot about with the borderline style, that it evokes countertransference reactions, right?
And some people even use a transference focus therapy for people with BPD. I know that's one of the recommendations. I haven't tried it though.
My response to that is the same one I gave the folks at this talk, where I said, well, my form of therapy is contra-transference. I want to undermine any transference the moment it arises, because any transference is not seeing me. And if we are going to have a relationship, the relationship has to be on who you really are and who I really am. I don't want to, in any degree, abet fantasies about me that aren't true. It seems like a long way around. So, as I say, I think that diagnosis does have a purpose, because it's important as we research our brains deeper and understand that there can be some neurological basis to the way we experience the world. Where that also becomes a problem is, okay, if it's neurological, it's fixed, as opposed to the fact that our brains are incredibly adaptable and plastic. And different experiences, our brain changes.
And even just with this neuroplasticity, even doing an 8-week mindfulness course, which I did recently, can change parts of your brains. I'd like to thank Ellis Amdur for his spectacular insights. Please come back on November 1st for the second half of this conversation. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.